Summer 1943, Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The brown liquid fizzed inside a glass bottle, catching the afternoon light. A young German prisoner, once a radio operator in the Afrika Korps, stared at it as if it were alchemy. The bottle was cold, sweating in the heat, its cap already twisted off by an American guard who smiled and gestured for him to drink. The soldier hesitated, then lifted it to his lips. The first sip was unlike anything he had ever tasted, sweet, sharp, alive. The carbonation tingled against his tongue, bubbles rising like laughter. He swallowed, eyes widening. He had fought for 2 years across the burning sands of Tunisia and Libya, living on biscuits so dry they shattered like dust and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley. Now, behind barbed wire in an enemy land, he tasted abundance. It cost 5 cents, the guard told him so, the same price that American children paid in their neighborhoods. 5 cents for a miracle in a bottle. By that summer, over 370,000 German prisoners of war were scattered across camps in the United States. They had arrived expecting punishment. Propaganda had warned them that American decadence meant weakness, that capture meant starvation and humiliation. What they found instead was contradiction embodied: electric lights in barracks, hot water, orderly meals, and dessert sweet enough to make their teeth ache. Camp Crossville, tucked in the green hills of Tennessee, was no paradise. It was fenced, guarded, disciplined. Yet, compared to the bombed-out ruins of Europe, it might as well have been another planet. The transformation had begun months earlier, in the deserts of North Africa. The surrender in Tunisia that May had brought nearly 250,000 Axis troops into Allied hands. These were not raw recruits. They were veterans hardened by Rommel's campaigns, men who had marched through sandstorms and gunfire under the swastika's shadow. They expected brutality. They expected hunger. Instead, within hours of capture, they were handed American field rations, care rations, designed for soldiers in the field, wrapped neatly in waxed cardboard. Inside were crackers, processed cheese, chocolate, fruit bars, cigarettes, and packets of sugar. American troops often mocked these rations, calling them monotonous. To the Germans, they were feasts. In one processing camp in North Africa, U.S. cooks served pancakes with syrup and milk, foods German units hadn't seen in years. The prisoners ate in silence at first, unsure if this generosity was mockery. Then came confusion, then disbelief. When American guards joked about the bad coffee, German officers exchanged looks. The same brown powder that had been a luxury back home was considered poor quality here. They were learning their first lesson in America's unspoken weapon, abundance. The voyage to the United States only deepened that education. Liberty ships carried thousands across the Atlantic each month. Built in assembly lines, one ship was launched every 42 hours, an industrial rhythm unimaginable to the Germans who boarded them. Each vessel carried not only men, but a revelation. The prisoners ate the same rations as the crew: meat, vegetables, bread, coffee with milk and sugar. The ship's refrigeration kept everything fresh. Logs from the USS General M. B. Stewart recorded an entry that July, ice cream served to prisoners for Independence Day. Ice cream. In the middle of the Atlantic. Some of the men cried. Not from joy, but from the absurdity of it. To eat frozen cream and sugar while their comrades still starved in Tunisia defied every wartime truth they had been taught. When they docked in Norfolk, Virginia, and saw the immense naval yards, piers stretching for miles, cranes lifting steel crates with mechanical ease, they began to grasp the scale of their captor's world. The Norfolk base alone handled more cargo in a single day than entire German ports did in a week. From there, the prisoners boarded trains that sliced through the American countryside. They passed tobacco fields, corn taller than men, cities glittering under electric signs. On the train, they were given real meals: fried chicken, vegetables, pie. The dining cars were clean, the food warm. At first, the Germans assumed it was a show, propaganda for their benefit. But when guards explained that this was simply normal American rail service, the illusion cracked further. When the trains finally arrived at inland camps like Crossville, Aliceville, and Hearne, the men found barracks with electric lights, flush toilets, and heating. Geneva Convention compliance was visible in every structure. Yet the real revolution waited inside the camp exchanges, the PX stores. Behind glass counters sat treasures that most of these men had never owned. Candy bars wrapped in colored foil. Cigarettes by the carton. Bottles of Coca-Cola sweating in ice. A can of beer, weak but cold. All of it available for pocket change. The U.S. Army paid them 80 cents a day for camp labor, maintenance, agriculture, or workshops. Later, the rate would rise to a full $1. At 5 cents for a candy bar or a soda, a day's work could buy 16 small luxuries. To Germans who had watched their homeland collapse under rationing and scarcity, this was sorcery. One POW later wrote in his camp diary, "In Germany, such things required a connection to the party. Here, even the lowest guard or worker buys them like bread." Coca-Cola became the camp's obsession. The drink's perfect uniformity, every bottle identical whether in Tennessee or Texas, fascinated the prisoners with engineering minds. They learned that the syrup was made in Atlanta, then distributed to hundreds of bottling plants nationwide. The logistics, the quality control, the precision of production, all contradicted Nazi propaganda that portrayed America as chaotic and materialistic. Records show that Camp Hearne, Texas, received around 7,000 bottles weekly that summer. Prisoners queued for them like worshippers at a shrine. For 5 cents, they could drink what had become the symbol of American industrial democracy. In letters home, carefully censored but preserved, they described this new world obliquely. One wrote to his wife in Bremen, "The enemy lives as if the war does not exist. Even the children here drink sugar water from glass bottles." Another confessed, "They have so much that waste itself is routine. What we call luxury, they call everyday." By August 1943, the impact was visible in body and mind. Camp medical reports recorded steady weight gain among German POWs, some adding 10 to 15 pounds within weeks. They worked, played soccer, attended English classes, and lined up at the PX for sodas and ice cream. Ice cream, above all, became mythic. For many, it was the first they had tasted since the 1930s. The Americans made it in batches, churning with salt and ice, serving it in metal cups that fogged with cold. At Camp Shelby, Mississippi, that July 4th, prisoners watched as U.S. soldiers hand-cranked freezers to make gallons of the frozen dessert. They were invited to try it. Vanilla, chocolate, strawberry, flavors that had become legend in war-starved Europe. A POW named Hans Keller later recalled, "We watched them pour cream and sugar as if it were nothing. Ice was melting on the ground while our families at home burned furniture for heat." It wasn't just the sweetness, it was the casualness. Ice, sugar, cream, all used not for survival, but pleasure. That was the second great lesson, that strength could come from comfort, not deprivation. In Germany, ration books dictated survival. A civilian might receive 280 grams of sugar per month, barely enough to sweeten tea. In American camps, sugar bowls sat open on mess hall tables. Prison cooks threw away hardened sugar rather than rescue it. At Camp Aliceville, kitchen staff dumped several hundred pounds of clumped sugar after a humid spell. The Germans were horrified. To waste food in wartime was sacrilege. Yet here, it was routine. To the Americans, it wasn't waste, it was efficiency. There would always be more. Candy was the final revelation. Hershey, Mars, and Nestle, names whispered like talismans. The military bought hundreds of millions of pounds of chocolate for soldiers and prisoners alike. At the PX, a bar cost 5 cents. At first, prisoners treated them as rare prizes, saving wrappers as keepsakes. Later, they bought them by the handful. When Red Cross parcels arrived monthly, boxes filled with canned meat, coffee, crackers, and chocolate bars, the Germans realized that these luxuries were not luxuries at all in America. They were simply part of life. The psychological shift was quiet but irreversible. Thanksgiving brought it into focus. In November 1943, every American prison camp served the same meal as U.S. soldiers: roast turkey, stuffing, sweet potatoes, cranberry sauce, pumpkin pie. Even the cranberry jelly came in molded shapes, delivered by the ton. The logistics were staggering: hundreds of thousands of turkeys distributed across 400,000 prisoners and millions of troops. And yet, to the Americans, it was only proper. A German lieutenant who had fought at Tobruk wrote in disbelief, "They give their enemies turkey on a silver plate. They have defeated us not with guns, but with food." Christmas followed with equal generosity. Church groups and civic organizations sent packages to POWs: cookies, cigarettes, playing cards, even small gifts. In Tonkawa, Oklahoma, local families baked cookies for the German prisoners. One old woman handed them out through the fence, saying softly, "It's Christmas for everyone." For men raised under an ideology that preached strength through domination, this quiet mercy was devastating. By early 1944, German officers began noting the changes among their men. The hostility had faded. The talk of the fatherland's victory grew quieter. The younger ones, especially, started to smile more, joke with guards, even hum American songs they heard on camp radios. The transformation wasn't taught, it was absorbed. Every bite, every bottle, every spoonful of ice cream chipped away at their old world. When night fell over Camp Crossville, the sounds of laughter drifted through the Tennessee air. Crickets sang in the fields. Somewhere, a phonograph played Glenn Miller's In the Mood. Behind the barbed wire, under the same stars that once shone over the Sahara, 1,000 men who had marched for the Reich now sat eating chocolate and drinking Coca-Cola, their minds quietly unraveling. They didn't yet realize it, but they were part of the most extraordinary re-education program in modern history, one that required no lectures, no slogans, no punishments. Only the steady rhythm of meals served on time, sugar bowls never empty, and the taste of something impossibly sweet on a hot American day. And somewhere between that first fizzing sip of Coca-Cola and the clink of empty bottles returned to the PX, they began to understand a truth that would outlast their captivity: that abundance, freely shared, could conquer where armies could not. January 1944, Camp Aliceville, Alabama. The frost came late that winter. Each morning, a fine mist hovered over the wire fences, softening the outline of guard towers against the gray sky. The German prisoners woke to the clang of the morning bell, boots thudding on the wooden floors. Steam rose from the mess hall, carrying the smell of coffee, real coffee, not the scorched barley or acorn substitute they had drunk for years. Inside, long rows of tin trays slid down the line: scrambled eggs, buttered toast, bacon. A few men still hesitated at the bacon, some from faith, others from guilt. Most simply took it, the smell too good to refuse. On the far end, a large metal vat hissed quietly. Milk. Cold, white, plentiful. To many of them, this scene had become routine. That was the strange part. What once felt like fantasy had turned into habit. And habit, as one camp psychologist later observed, is the softest weapon of all. The United States had refined its prisoner management into a precise system by early 1944. The Geneva Convention guided the structure, but America's industrial mindset made it efficient. There were nearly 450 camps spread across the country now, from dusty ranchland in Arizona to dense pine forests in Maine. Each camp functioned like a small town, complete with canteens, libraries, schools, and infirmaries. The prisoners worked on farms, in sawmills, or repairing roads, paid in credits redeemable at the PX. The result was not only economic utility but quiet influence. Wherever the German prisoners labored, they saw the scale of American agriculture: tractors roaring through fields the size of villages, mechanical harvesters swallowing acres of corn, railcars filled with wheat. They worked beside civilian farmers who treated them not as monsters, but as workers. Many Americans, especially in the rural South and Midwest, had never met a German before. To them, these blond, weary young men were just the boys from over there. One farmer in Iowa told his wife after the POWs left for the day, "They work hard, polite too. You'd never think they were soldiers." That sentiment was mutual. The prisoners, accustomed to the rigid hierarchy of the Wehrmacht, were stunned by the casual equality of American civilians. Farmers chatted with guards as if rank didn't exist. Women ran stores, drove trucks, managed accounts. Teenagers delivered supplies with radios blaring swing music. The entire rhythm of life pulsed with confidence and energy. At night, the POWs would talk about it in their bunks. Some argued that it was deception, a propaganda mask. Others, quietly, began to wonder if this was simply what freedom looked like when it was built on abundance rather than conquest. In the spring of 1944, a new kind of education began inside the camps. At first, it was simple: English lessons, basic civics, history classes. The War Department's goal was subtle reorientation, not indoctrination. The men who taught the classes were often professors or ministers drafted into service. They understood that a man's worldview could not be changed by argument alone, but by contrast. So they let the prisoners see America up close. At Camp Crossville, a special work detail was assigned to help a nearby college expand its library. The prisoners carried lumber, mixed cement, and rebuilt a staircase that had collapsed in winter. The dean, an older man with rimmed glasses, often brought them lemonade during breaks. He asked about their studies back home, their families, their thoughts on Goethe or Beethoven. One day, a guard overheard the dean asking a young corporal named Friedrich what he planned to do after the war. Friedrich hesitated, then said, "In Germany, we do not think so far. There will be no work." The dean nodded. "Then learn something while you can. The war will end, but the mind doesn't have to wait for peace." It was a simple exchange. Yet later that night, Friedrich wrote in his diary, "Today I met an enemy who built libraries while fighting a war. We destroy, they build. What will win in the end?" By summer, the prisoners were thriving physically. Medical records show steady improvements in nutrition and health across camps. Vitamin deficiencies that had plagued them in Africa vanished. Dental records note remarkable recovery of gum health due to balanced diet and sugar consumption, a line that still baffles historians. But beneath that physical renewal came something deeper: the erosion of certainty. When the first reports of Allied landings in Normandy reached the camps in June 1944, the Germans crowded around bulletin boards. Official communiques were limited, but rumors spread fast. Some believed it was just a diversion, others sensed the truth. What struck them most, however, was not just that the invasion was happening, but that life in the camps didn't change. Meals were still served on time. The PX still stocked Coca-Cola and candy. Ice cream was served that week as usual. The war might have been tightening its grip on Europe, but here, nothing faltered. The mathematics of abundance was absolute. Every bottle of soda represented steel, glass, sugar, refrigeration, transport, and labor, all coordinated effortlessly across a continent at war. The prisoners watched delivery trucks arrive on schedule, shelves restocked with precision, and workers joking as they unloaded crates. It was civilization in motion, uninterrupted. The contrast to Germany's crumbling logistics was unbearable. Back home, Allied bombers had crippled railways, fuel was rationed, and cities lived in darkness. Letters from families described hunger, shortages, cold. Meanwhile, their captors lived as though war were merely a distant echo. That dissonance broke many of them, not in despair, but in realization. For the first time, they understood that industrial might was not just about weapons. It was about ice cream that didn't melt on a train from St. Louis to Alabama. It was about milk delivered daily even in wartime. It was about a society that could fight and still feed, build, and dream. A U.S. Army report from the Office of the Provost Marshal General, dated August 12, 1944, summarized the transformation in bureaucratic prose. Morale among German prisoners remained stable and generally positive. Instances of escape or insubordination are minimal. Many appear more curious than hostile toward American life. Exposure to domestic standards of comfort and liberty has produced a marked change in attitude. Behind those cold words was something profound, the beginning of reconciliation through routine. Late that autumn, the POWs began receiving American newspapers, heavily censored but intact enough to glimpse the world outside. They read about rationing at home, not starvation, but conservation. They saw photographs of American women welding ships, children collecting tin for drives, movie stars selling war bonds. It wasn't propaganda. It was real. At Camp Tonkawa, one prisoner remarked to another while reading a paper, "Their women build tanks, yet they still bake cookies for Christmas." The other nodded. Maybe that is their secret. They fight and live at the same time. For many, that was the moment the old myths about America shattered for good. They began to understand that what they were seeing, the open stores, the endless food, the smiles, was not deception. It was the product of a system that valued efficiency over ideology, cooperation over hierarchy. Some POWs started sketching the machines they saw in farm sheds or reading about American business methods in donated textbooks. Others joined camp orchestras, performing jazz standards for their captors. When asked why they played American songs, one violinist shrugged, "Because they sound free." By December 1944, snow had blanketed much of the American heartland. The camps glittered under the pale sun, their fences rimmed with frost. The guards decorated the towers with lights. Inside, the prisoners prepared small Christmas celebrations. That year, a Coca-Cola truck arrived late one afternoon at Camp Crossville. The driver was an old man, laughing, his red scarf blowing in the wind. He had driven from Atlanta, bringing crates as a holiday bonus. The POWs watched in disbelief as he handed them out, dozens of bottles, cold from the truck's ice compartments. The camp commander announced over the loudspeaker, "Compliments of the company." Each man received one bottle. Some drank immediately, others saved theirs, unwilling to break the magic. The label gleamed red against the snow. A few toasted quietly in their barracks, murmuring, "Auf das Ende," to the end. For them, that moment encapsulated everything: defeat, kindness, absurdity, and hope. That winter, word began spreading through the POW system of a rumor, an unthinkable one. That some prisoners, once repatriated, might be offered the chance to return to the United States voluntarily after the war. Most dismissed it as fantasy. Yet deep down, a seed had been planted. For men who had tasted both the terror of battle and the sweetness of Coca-Cola, the idea didn't seem so impossible. As one officer wrote later, "We began the war believing the world was divided between masters and slaves. In America, we learned there could be another order, one where even prisoners drink from glass bottles." April 12, 1945, Camp Hearn, Texas. The siren didn't signal danger that morning, it signaled history. The loudspeaker crackled across the camp as guards gathered by the administration building. A voice, strained but steady, announced, "President Roosevelt is dead." For a long moment, there was silence. Even the wind seemed to pause. The German prisoners stood motionless, unsure of the proper reaction. Some whispered to each other in disbelief. Roosevelt, the distant giant who had commanded their captivity, the man they had learned to both fear and respect, was gone. Then, something extraordinary happened. The camp's flagpole, where the stars and stripes flew each morning, remained bare that day. Hours later, a group of German officers, once officers of the Afrika Korps, requested permission to conduct a small memorial. The American commander agreed. As dusk fell, the prisoners formed ranks and stood in silence. No orders, no speeches, just quiet respect. One man laid a handkerchief across his cap in mourning. That scene, recorded in the camp's daily log, was more than gesture. It marked the moral turning point of captivity. By then, most of them knew the war was lost. But for the first time, they began to feel that defeat did not mean ruin. It could mean renewal. The first cracks in certainty had appeared months earlier. Through late 1944 and early 1945, news seeped into the camps through radio broadcasts, censored letters, and Red Cross bulletins. The Allies had crossed the Rhine. Berlin was surrounded. Cities like Dresden and Cologne lay in ruins. But it was the news from Poland that hit hardest, the revelations from camps with names like Majdanek and Auschwitz. At first, disbelief was universal. The idea that their nation, their Germany, had built factories of death was too monstrous to accept. Propaganda, they said. Lies. The Americans were exaggerating to break their spirit. Then came photographs. In May 1945, a Red Cross team arrived at Camp Aliceville with leaflets showing the liberation of Buchenwald and Dachau. The pictures were grainy, but unmistakable: skeletal men behind barbed wire, piles of shoes, the faces of children too weak to stand. The POWs stared in silence. Some refused to look, others tore the pages, shouting that it was staged. But a few didn't. They kept the pages folded in their pockets, returning to them at night, tracing the faces with trembling fingers. One prisoner, a former schoolteacher named Otto, wrote in his diary that evening, "If it is true, then what we fought for is worse than defeat. It is shame. Perhaps this is why they give us Coca-Cola and kindness. They do not hate us, they pity us." That realization spread slowly, unevenly, but irresistibly. The Americans didn't lecture. They didn't need to. Every act of normalcy, every fair ration, every unguarded laugh, became a quiet indictment of the world the prisoners had served. As spring turned to summer, the camps filled with uncertainty. Germany had surrendered on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. The guards announced it with calm professionalism, reading from printed orders: "Hostilities have ceased." There were no cheers, no songs. The men simply stood there, stunned, as though the words themselves were heavier than the years that led to them. Then came a silence that lasted for days. No one quite knew what they were now. They were no longer soldiers, but not yet free. The American flag still flew above the camp. Meals were served as usual, but the food no longer tasted the same. Freedom, once an abstract hope, had become complicated. Many feared what awaited them back home. Letters hinted at devastation: cities flattened, families displaced, women scraping by on scraps. Some prisoners whispered that returning to Germany would mean starvation. Others confessed something they would have once called betrayal: that they didn't want to leave America at all. In late May, the American government began a new phase, the reorientation program. It wasn't punishment, it was preparation. Teams of American educators, chaplains, and even German-speaking professors toured the camps, screening films about democracy, Reconstruction, and the Nuremberg principles. They held discussions about freedom of speech, the press, and law. At first, many POWs mocked the sessions as propaganda. But the films were different from what they expected. They didn't glorify America, they showed its flaws. Strikes, political debates, racial tensions, unconcealed, unedited. For men raised under a regime that demanded silence, the mere sight of dissent was a revelation. One film, The Town That Wasn't There, depicted a community rebuilding after a flood. Ordinary citizens debated how to allocate resources, argued, voted, compromised. It was mundane, and that was precisely the point. Freedom wasn't chaos. It was process. After one screening, a prisoner named Werner asked the instructor, "Why do you show us your disagreements? Doesn't it make your country look weak?" The instructor smiled. "Because disagreement means we're still listening." In the following months, POW newspapers, printed inside the camps under U.S. supervision, began publishing essays by prisoners themselves. Titles like "Germany's Future Without Tyranny" and "We Were Soldiers, Not Monsters" filled the mimeographed pages. For the first time, they were writing their own reckoning. One issue from Camp Crossville featured an editorial by a 26-year-old former Luftwaffe pilot. We have seen the America of the Coca-Cola bottle and the factory worker, of the church choir and the jazz club. We came here believing in strength through fear. We will leave believing in strength through fairness. If we can rebuild Germany with even half this balance, we might deserve forgiveness. It wasn't just reflection, it was evolution. The War Department took notice. Reports from camp supervisors noted that attitudes among POWs have shifted markedly toward self-critique and admiration of democratic processes. By September 1945, several thousand prisoners had volunteered for re-education lectures voluntarily. Yet, even amid reflection, contradictions lingered. At Camp Herne, a small group of die-hard Nazis still held secret meetings, preaching resistance. They called themselves the True Germans, hoping to preserve the spirit of the Reich. But their power was fading fast. Most prisoners ignored them. The rest pitied them. In one symbolic moment recorded in a guard's report, a younger prisoner, barely 19, walked up to the group during roll call and tore the swastika patch from his coat. He dropped it in the mud and walked away. No one stopped him. That gesture, small and silent, spread through the camp like wildfire. Within a week, dozens had done the same. Then came the repatriations. By the end of 1945, trains began carrying men eastward again, through fields now turning gold in autumn, through cities alive with neon light. The journey home was nothing like the one that had brought them here. No chains, no hostility. Just quiet reflection. At every stop, local civilians gathered to wave goodbye. Farmers who had worked with them brought fruit, bread, even homemade pies. Children shouted, "Good luck." Some of the POWs wept openly. Others tried to smile. In the final report from Camp Aliceville, dated October 31, 1945, the commanding officer wrote, "Departure of last German contingent completed. Conduct exemplary, several prisoners expressed gratitude for fair treatment. One remarked, 'We arrived as enemies and leave as men.'" When the ships departed from New York Harbor, carrying thousands of returning prisoners across the Atlantic, the men lined the decks. They looked at the skyline, towers of glass and steel glowing against the night, and understood that they were leaving more than a country. They were leaving a vision of the future. The Coca-Cola bottles were gone, the PX shelves empty, the ice cream a memory. But the taste remained. It had imprinted itself deeper than ideology. As the Statue of Liberty faded into mist, a few men saluted quietly, not out of allegiance, but respect. They had come to fight a nation and discovered a civilization. Months later, in the ruins of post-war Germany, those same men would speak of America not as conqueror, but as example. Many became teachers, engineers, or translators in the U.S. occupation zones. Some returned decades later as immigrants. Others never did, but all carried a shared secret, that they had glimpsed the power of a society that could feed both body and conscience. One former prisoner, writing in 1948, summarized it simply, "We were taught that victory meant power. America taught us that victory means plenty. And plenty shared freely is the hardest victory of all." March 1946, Bremen, Germany. The ship SS George Washington eased into port beneath a sky the color of ash. On deck, hundreds of German POWs, men who had spent years in American camps, leaned against the rails, squinting at the gray skyline. Smoke drifted from chimneys that burned anything that would catch. Buildings stood half-collapsed, streets pitted with rubble. When they had left, Germany had still believed it could win. Now, the country itself looked defeated, hollowed out, and starving. As the men stepped ashore, they were thinner in spirit but heavier in body. Many had gained 15, even 20 pounds in captivity. They were healthier, stronger, more alert. Doctors conducting repatriation checks noted it in disbelief. The average German POW returning from the United States shows improved nutrition and general health despite long captivity. And in their duffel bags, they carried something else, small miracles of color and taste. Chocolate bars wrapped in silver paper, tins of instant coffee, cans of condensed milk, packets of sugar, still marked U.S. Army ration. They guarded them like treasure. Not because of their material worth, but because of what they represented, a glimpse of a world that had defeated them not with bombs, but with plenty. Their families could scarcely believe the stories. When former POWs told of ice cream served weekly, of Coca-Cola bottles for 5 cents, of American guards who offered candy to their captives, they were met with disbelief, sometimes resentment. "How can it be?" mothers asked, scraping flour from empty sacks. "You were prisoners, yet you ate better than we did free." It was true. And that truth hurt. But it also awakened something: curiosity, envy, and then hope. If the enemy could build such abundance, perhaps Germany could too. By 1947, those stories had spread through towns and cities still marked by ration lines and hunger. The word Coca-Cola itself had become a symbol of the unattainable. Children whispered it as if it were magic. Some returning prisoners carried empty bottles home as proof. In certain villages, they were placed on shelves like relics. One former sergeant, interviewed years later, said, "I brought an empty Coca-Cola bottle to my son. He was 4. He didn't believe it was real. He thought I had invented it to make him laugh." But soon, the bottle would return to Germany, not as memory, but as messenger. 1949, Frankfurt. The first post-war bottling plant opened under license from the Coca-Cola Company. Its slogan, translated into German, read, "Macht der Freude auf," open happiness. For many Germans, it was more than advertising, it was aspiration. Coca-Cola trucks began to appear on cobblestone streets beside rubble piles. The drink that once symbolized the enemy now represented renewal. Cafes sold it alongside black bread and ersatz coffee. Teenagers saved ration stamps to taste it. Each sip carried memory, of captivity, of abundance, of the strange realization that the democratic world could be both powerful and kind. Those who had been prisoners were the first to understand the deeper meaning. They became informal ambassadors of the American way, not the military one, but the everyday one. When American advisors arrived with the Marshall Plan in 1948, they found a surprising ally: former POWs who spoke fluent English, understood rationing systems, and believed in productivity as the path to freedom. They told their countrymen, "The Americans do not give charity, they build opportunity." In West German factories rising from ruins, men who had once labored in Tennessee fields or Nebraska canneries now applied lessons learned behind fences: standardization, quality control, efficiency through abundance. The result was astonishing. Between 1949 and 1955, West German industrial output quadrupled. Economists would later call it the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. But for those who had seen America's factories firsthand, it wasn't magic. It was method. They had seen how a single product, Coca-Cola, Hershey bars, even ice cream, could represent an entire philosophy, that prosperity could be shared, not hoarded. Food became the new diplomacy. When American occupation forces distributed chocolate and gum to German children in 1945, it wasn't just generosity, it was symbolism. The same items that had amazed POWs now served to rebuild trust among civilians. One famous newsreel from Berlin showed U.S. airmen dropping candy from the sky during the Berlin airlift of 1948. Children called them Rosenbomber, raisin bombers. They waved handmade flags, shouting with joy as parachutes of sweets fluttered down. Some of those children were the sons of former POWs who had once marveled at the same sugar-fueled miracle in American camps. History was repeating itself, not through conquest, but through kindness. By the early 1950s, the echoes of captivity had woven themselves into the new German identity. Ice cream parlors opened across Munich, Cologne, Hamburg. They mimicked American soda fountains: red stools, chrome counters, tall glass cups with scoops stacked high and cherries on top. For a generation that had known only scarcity, the sight of a child eating freely was almost sacred. Coca-Cola became part of everyday language. So did chocolate. So did the idea that democracy didn't just protect freedom, it produced flavor. Supermarkets, another American invention, arrived in 1957. Shelves lined with hundreds of products replaced the bare counters of the old ration shops. And among the managers and suppliers were men who had once studied American logistics from behind barbed wire. They applied what they'd seen: standard sizes, regional distribution, refrigeration for perishables. The result was a transformation so rapid that visitors from Britain and France called it the German miracle. But the former prisoners knew, it was no miracle. It was memory, made material. Even decades later, the stories persisted. In 1975, a documentary team interviewed surviving members of the Afrika Korps who had been held in the U.S. One of them, by then a retired engineer, smiled as he recalled his first taste of Coca-Cola. It was like drinking the future. We didn't understand it then, but it was democracy in a bottle. Another veteran, asked what moment changed him most, didn't mention battles or bombs. He said quietly, "The first time I saw Americans throw away half a candy bar. I realized then, they lived in a world so rich they could waste sweetness. That's when I stopped believing in superiority." The archives tell the rest. Between 1943 and 1946, over 371,000 German POWs lived in camps across the United States. Daily rations averaged 3,400 calories, more than most American civilians received. Sugar, ice cream, and soft drinks flowed in quantities unimaginable in Europe. Even under rationing, America's factories produced 7 million tons of sugar, 5 billion bottles of Coca-Cola, 380 million pounds of chocolate, and 500 million gallons of ice cream annually. The contrast was not theoretical, it was measurable. German civilian rations during the same years averaged 1,300 calories daily. Milk was scarce, meat rarer still, and sugar almost mythical. In some regions, children grew up without ever tasting chocolate. The prisoners had lived through both worlds, and their memories became bridges. When historians later examined the phenomenon, they found something remarkable: the most successful re-education program of the war had no lectures, no slogans, no indoctrination. It had desserts. Dr. Arnold Kramer, who devoted decades to studying POW experiences, wrote, "Food abundance, observed rather than explained, accomplished ideological transformation more effectively than any propaganda." The enemy was educated not by argument but by appetite. That transformation, he argued, helped lay the groundwork for post-war reconciliation, and for a Germany that would rebuild on principles of productivity, not plunder. And so, the story comes full circle. Summer 1943, a German soldier in Tennessee holds a bottle of Coca-Cola for the first time, marveling at its fizzing sweetness. Summer 1953, his son, in Hamburg, buys the same drink from a street vendor for the same nickel, 5 cents that had outlasted empires. What began as a prisoner's curiosity had become a nation's rebirth. The ideology that once promised glory through sacrifice had fallen. In its place rose a quieter, humbler belief, that true strength lay in the ability to create abundance, to share sweetness even in the shadow of war. And if history has a flavor, perhaps it is this: the cold glass of a Coca-Cola bottle sweating in the Tennessee heat, the taste of vanilla ice cream melting on a summer afternoon, the sound of laughter where hatred once lived. Because sometimes, victory doesn't roar, it fizzes. Sometimes, freedom isn't a speech, it's a spoonful of sugar. And sometimes, the greatest revolution begins not with a gun, but with a taste, sweet, cold, and impossible.